Hello, today we're going to talk about how to do the National 5 Explain question. Now, the National 5 Explain question asks you to explain the impact, the cause, or effect of an event. Basically, it's looking for a more complex understanding of a particular issue. In order to do this, you have to first detail a factor. So, give a particular example and then explain how it answers the question. So, you must relate whichever factor or fact that you have highlighted and then relate it to the question. Now there are three explain questions in the exam, one in each section, one in the Scottish section, one in the British section, one in the World section, and each one is worth 6 marks, so overall they are worth 18 marks. So along with the 9-mark essay and the how fully question, these are the most important questions in terms of marks available in the exam. One of the main issues that candidates have when answering these questions is they don't really understand what we mean by explaining. And so trying to get your head around the idea of what it means to fully explain something should hopefully give you a better understanding of how exactly to approach these questions. So explaining is quite a challenging historical skill. The explain questions are generally recognised as being the most difficult questions. They are the ones that are the most poorly done in the exam and the ones that most candidates struggle with most when trying to get marks. So if you are able to master these questions, you have a very good chance of scoring highly in the exam. So when we're doing these types of questions, it's perhaps easiest to think of them as considering why something happened rather than what happened. And what we mean by that is, if you think about, for example, the abolition campaign, we could talk about what happened. We could say what happened during the abolition campaign, and we'd say, well, there were petitions, there were boycotts, there were speeches. That was what happened during the abolition campaign. But if we wanted to know why the abolitionist campaign succeeded, we'd have to explain why boycotts or speeches eventually led to the law being changed, to the passing of the 1807 slave trade bill. So what happened is just giving facts. There was a boycott, there were speeches, there were petitions. Why the abolition campaign was successful is, well, the sugar boycotts led to an undermining of the economic reasons for slavery, because once people were boycotting sugar that was produced by slaves, plantation owners were no longer making money from it. So that is a why. So if the question was explain the reasons why the abolitionist campaign was successful, you couldn't just say sugar boycotts, because that's a fact, not an explanation. You'd have to say one reason was sugar boycotts. This was because the sugar boycotts undermined the economic reasons that slavery existed. That is explaining. You are giving some whys rather than some whats. So as long as you're thinking of that in your head, am I explaining why something happened and not just what happened, then you're well on the way to doing well in the explain question. There's a particular structure that we use in order to kind of force you into doing that, and if you adopt this structure, then it's much more likely that you'll be doing the why part rather than just the what part. So in order to make sure that you are answering why and therefore fully explaining, please follow these structural points. First, use the wording of the question. If it's explain the reasons why the abolitionist campaign was successful, one reason the abolitionist campaign was successful. Give a piece of factual knowledge, so for example it can be sugar boycotts. Then use this key phrase, this meant that. Now, this meant that is forcing you to do the why part of the question. It's forcing you to actually give an explanation. And then you give the explanation, and that is the mark. You get a mark for each explained fact. So you have to do all 4 parts to get a mark. That does mean that the explain questions can take a little bit longer than perhaps some of the other ones, than the marks available in the describe question or some of the marks available in the how fully question. But if you are able to do it this way and you get into a habit of doing it this way, you should be able to quite easily pick up the marks. So I've color coded these to allow you to kind of see the different parts. So using the wording of the question, giving a piece of factual knowledge, using the words this meant that, and giving an explanation. So we can see in green, slaves found it difficult to resist on plantations because, that's using the wording of the question. The question is obviously, why did slaves find it difficult to resist on plantations? A reason they found it difficult to resist on plantations is a piece of factual knowledge in red. They could be punished violently with items like thumbscrews. So we've used the question, we've given a fact. Now, to do the explain part, using the words this meant that in blue, and then finally, they were scared of the consequences of resisting is the explanation bit. So, slaves were found it difficult to resist on plantations due to torture methods like thumbscrews. This meant that they were scared of the consequences. So, torture methods made slaves scared to resist. That is how to explain an explain point. So using the question, giving a fact, using the words this meant that, and then giving an explanation. Now I've written out a model answer for you to see. Explain the reasons why the slave trade was important to Britain. So it was important to Britain because it created a large number of jobs. This meant that more British people were employed. So we've used the question, given a fact, created jobs, then given an explanation why that was important to Britain. And again, it helped shipbuilding grow, more jobs and wealth was created, helped port cities grow and develop. Cities like Glasgow and Bristol it become more important. The money was used to help fund many buildings. British cities grew and became larger and more impressive. It was provided cotton for factories. This meant a key industry was able to develop, and it helped banking and insurance industry grow. This meant Britain will become richer and more powerful. So each one of these facts is explained by linking it to the question, linking it to the reason why the slave trade was important to British cities, or important to Britain. So let me just re-stress the fact that when you're doing these questions, you must make sure you're explaining, make sure that you're doing the why part. And in order to see that you're doing that, make sure you're answering the question. Have I given a reason that explains what the question is asking? It explains the reasons why the slave trade was important to Britain, explains why it was difficult for slaves to resist on plantations, explains why abolition was successful, explains why it took so long for abolition to pass, explains why the slave trade had such a big effect on Africa, or explains why the slave trade had such a negative effect on the Caribbean. It is about explaining, giving reasons why, and relating them to the question. If you're able to do that, and able to follow the structure, you will be doing very well. You will get a significant number of marks. And as always, the best way to make sure you're doing this well is just to practice.